Hello, welcome to pretty much the first basically circuit tutorial you will see. It's not, technically it's not the first because you've already hopefully watched the introduction to all the pins, but we are going to be starting with something simple, something everyone will need, and that is pretty much activation. Now, if you remember activation, those are those little triangular orange pins. And where do we see them mostly? On buttons, of course. So we're gonna go over inputs today. So over here, under props, dynamic, we find the button V2. We find another one, toggle button V2. And under gadgets and other gadgets, we find the trigger volume V2, and we're gonna go over all of these. So props, button. Let's spawn in a button. Button is nothing much. We're greeted with our traditional Rec Room button and all of these pins. Now we're gonna go through them all. So I'm gonna leave this one for last. So we're gonna go through the main and basic functions. So pretty much, as I said, these are the signal pins, power pins, whatever you would like to call them. And if we look at what it says here, it pretty much tells us what these output. So if I press the button, the pressed pin right here will output a signal. And if I hold it, as soon as I pressed it, of course, it output a signal. But if I hold it and release it after a bit, the released pin right here outputs another signal. That's how those two work. So next we still have the player pins and the is pressed pin. So the player pin outputs the player that pressed the button. That's why they're grouped together. So if they're close like that, means they're grouped together and they work with each other. Which means that when we press it, it outputs a signal when we press it, and it outputs the player that pressed it. Same thing for released. So the player that pressed it is being output, and the player that released it is being output. Next, we have the is pressed pin, which is pretty much a value which can be true or false, just like we said in the beginning video. It's called a boolean, and it's pretty much self-explanatory. So if we hold it pressed, this value is going to be true because it is pressed. But if we release it, it's not pressed, which means that it'll be false. This is the basic button, and that also means we can easily go over the toggle button, because the toggle button acts in a similar way, and it doesn't have any more pins than the normal button. As you can see, it has the pressed pin and the player pin, which means I press it, it output a signal, and it told the game, the button told the game who pressed it. In my case, I pressed it, so my name goes through here. Same thing with released. We just released the button, signal out here, my name out here. Is pressed, same as this. So if it's activated, this is true. But if it's deactivated, it's false. Now we have the third one, which is special under gadgets, other gadgets, and trigger volume V2. This one has a lot more pins, but it's the same as these two, just with little functions we can't find here. In our case, it's these and these two. Well, you'll see that it's pretty much self-explanatory because it just tells you what it does. So, player entered, player exited acts the same way as pressed and released, just for trigger volume. So if I go in, I just entered it, and the trigger volume told the game who, entered it. This time it doesn't say player here, but it says value. And if I put my hand out, player exited, signal goes out here, and it tells the game who exited the trigger volume. Then we have this pin right here, player's pin. But if we look close, we have little brackets here. Basically, brackets, as we've learned previously, means a list of items. In our case, a list of players. Now, a list of players is only useful if there's multiple people in the trigger zone. So, let's say 3 people go into the trigger zone. Only one will be output here. But everyone will be output from the list, because a list, again... So basically, a list of players is a collection of values in one variable. But this, normal value, which is here and here, is a variable that can only store one value. So lists can store multiple, normal variables can store one. That's why these ones are useful, because, for example, you're going to be using it for a team select in a game. So a lot of players would go into a trigger zone, and the game would sort them out. And it output all of them, and you'd give them a role or something like that. So, similar with objects. So it says player entered here, but it says object entered here, which means that my maker pen is an object, which means that if I drop it in here, now of course it disappeared because I do not have it, because I don't have circuits visible when I don't hold my maker pen. But if I put the object in here, this will be activated because the object entered the trigger zone. So it'll output a signal and it'll tell the game which object it is. Same for exited. I just took my maker pen out, signal gets activated, and it says what exited the trigger volume. Now the same with the object list, which means that if we put multiple objects in here, let's say a ball, the maker pen, and a dart, it's gonna say all of these under the list, because again, it collects all of the current items in the trigger zone and puts them in here. But again, it'll only output one from here. We haven't gone over one pin yet, which is this one, this top one. Now, as we said previously, the yellow pins mean game specific, something that is unique to Rec Room. Basically, this uniquely identifies your object here. By that I mean that for the trigger volume, this is the best example. The trigger volume has circuits that allow filters. So if you remember from your normal trigger volume, the V1, you were able to filter out specific things, specific roles. You can do that here, but instead of configuring or any way you did it in V1, you use this pin. This is an example. Trigger volume get filter role. Basically what this does, we're gonna go in depth of trigger volumes some other time. Basically this will output the filter that this is currently set on. So the target basically means we have to tell this circuit which trigger zone it should check. And we tell it like that, because this is the unique identifier of our trigger zone. We connect that over to our chip. The chip knows which trigger zone to look at and it'll output value. In this case there is nothing because we didn't put any filters or anything on it. So this is how you would start your activations. Simple buttons, you can't go wrong with them. That's about it for the buttons. I hope the explanations were clear enough. And if they weren't, make sure to comment or go on the BOC Discord link below. Ask me any questions you have about circuits and I'll try and answer them as best as I can.